Hi, my name is Amy Howard. Today in this video I'm going to show you one of my favorite finishes, cracked patina. If you notice when you go antique shopping and you kind of peruse the room, or maybe you're at an antiques crafts fair or a flea market, the pieces that you're going to be most drawn to are going to be those pieces that have a lot of texture, a lot of depth, that are very grody, maybe a multi-layering of different colors. One of the ways to be able to get that is with our cracked patina. All right, so the first step that we want to be able to do in creating the cracked patina finish is we're going to find our piece that we're going to rescue. And I want to make sure that I clean it really well first with a degreaser. We want to make sure we get all the grime and the grease and anything that might have built up on that piece of furniture over the years of use. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to take our one-step paint and we're going to base coat it. So the first thing I want you to do is turn your first coat, your base coat of your one-step paint upside down. It's going to stay upside down for about 30 minutes. I want to be able to gather all my supplies together, and I want this can to stay upside down to allow all the yummy ingredients, the calcium carbonate particularly, to come to the top of the can, so when I turn it over to actually stir it up very well, that it's all mixed really well. So now my can over here, I've got it ready. It's actually a page blue. It's going to be my first base coat. I'm just going to stir it really well with my stir stick. And I'm going to take a China bristle brush. Now this particular piece of trim is actually raw. Working on small pieces of trim like this allow me to be able to have control over my finish, but it also allows me to be able to come up with how I want my finish to look like on my final piece. So as I'm painting my piece or my trim sample, I'm loading up my brush. I want to make sure that it's got ample amount of paint on it, but I'm offloading it because I don't want to be going over it too much, because there is a double processing element that will start to take place as it starts to dry. But you'll notice the coverage is really good here. I also want to make sure that there's no holidays. Now I've joked with people before and we've said holidays. Holidays is not the word for vacation. A holiday is actually an artistic term that there's an area that you don't actually have coverage. So I do want to make sure that we get that 100% covered. The great thing about the one-step paint when you're painting it on your piece is you don't have to strip it, you don't have to sand it, you don't have to prime it with anything. You can put the one-step paint directly on top of your piece that already has lacquer, shellac, that type thing on it. So I'm gonna make sure that I have really good coverage. I want to make sure that there are no holidays, and I'm gonna let this dry for about 20 to 30 minutes. It's gonna dry to a completely dead flat matte finish. So after my piece is dry, you can see the coverage. There's a little areas where if I was going to leave this and not actually put my cracked patina on next, I might come back and put on a second coat or just kind of some application here and there. But for cracked patina, because it is a layering process, I'm ready for my next step. So I'm gonna take my cracked patina and I'm gonna shake it really well. You're going to notice when the weather, if it's cooler or hotter, when it's cooler, it's going to be a little bit thicker. So if it's going to be hotter, it may be a little thinner, but in the wintertime, you can add water if you want to. Giving it a good shake, I'm going to put it in a container like this, and I want to saturate my brush really well, offload it, and in the same direction as I was painting my paint, I want to make sure that I have 100% coverage, but I don't want it to be too thick. I don't want it to build up too much where it's too puddly. You see how I'm constantly moving my brush too? I always like that because it doesn't make it to where I can see what kind of tool. I don't see brush marks in it. And I do want to make sure that I've covered the entire surface with the cracked patina. Perfect. Now I'm gonna let this dry for about 30-45 minutes. If I want to let it dry for an hour, a couple of hours, and maybe pick my project back up tomorrow, that's completely fine as well. So after my cracked patina has dried, this is probably be about an hour dry time, completely to the touch. It's gonna be slick, but it's not going to be sticky. If it's sticky, allow it to dry just a little bit longer. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take my top coat color, which is going to be French blue in our one step. So I'm loading up my brush again. And I'm going to be really careful about my time here. I want to make sure, working on my piece in sections. So maybe I'm going to be doing the drawer of my piece. I'm going to make sure it's on a horizontal surface. I've got it laid down so I can see everything really well. Because what's going to happen, it's going to start to dry pretty quickly. I want to make sure that I'm loading up my paintbrush and I'm putting it on fairly quickly, and I'm not coming back over it and brushing it. So you'll notice up here already, it's kind of exciting. See how it's starting to dry already and go matte? How this area is wet and bright colored and glossy? So as it starts to dry, it's going to go that dead flat finish. So I'm going to take my China bristle brush. I'm making sure that it's laying horizontally like this, and I'm going to lay it like this because I love the fact that these bristles are going to add to my finish. And you'll see how I'm pulling it and agitating. Now, I want to make sure, see this area over here that's still wet? I want to make sure that that's starting to dry a little bit, not too much, before I actually start pulling it. If it's still too wet, it's going to take all of it off. And I do want to make sure that I'm turning my brush, because what will happen, I'm using this as a negative tool right now, but once it starts getting loaded up with paint, it's going to become a positive tool, and that's not desirable. So you see how it's naturally starting to pull this and allow my first base coat color to come through. So this has started to dry. I've already pulled it first with my brush, and now there's areas that I want to be able to pull with my hands. I'm making sure that my hands are nice and dry, that they're not wet, that they don't have another color paint on them. Love this. And I often talk about how when I go to New Orleans, I love being able to look at all the different shutters and how the shutters will have multicolors of red and black and different variations of blues and greens. And how when you see the smallest amount on this piece of trim is that pale color, remember that's always your first coat that you're going to apply. Now let's say I wanted to be able to put a green on top of this. I'm going to put another layer of my cracked patina, and then I'm going to put the green on top of it and do the same process again. So I can do multi-layering. Now, another thing that I want to make sure, after this is dried, this last application, I may come back here and there and just touch it up because I don't want it to look too raw. I'm taking this top coat color and just softening it. So I'm going to allow that to dry for about 20 or 30 minutes, and then I'm ready for my waxing. So right before we apply the wax, we may want to be able to take a little bit of sandpaper just to soften it. The whole reason for this process is not to wear it through, because we've already gotten that so easily by pulling it with our hands and pulling it with our brush. But this allows me to just be able to soften it a tad, so maybe it's not quite as rough as we would want it to be. Because if you think about with an antique, it's going to have worn over a long period of time. Hands are going to have touched it. Hips are going to have closed a drawer. Maybe the arms of a chair that we would have wrapped our arms around. That building up of the oils from our skin and the use of it is creating that patina, and over a period of time, it's not going to have been rough like that. So we just want to make sure that our edges are rounded a little bit, that we just soften it, not to pull through as wear. And then we're going to wax it. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to take our light antique wax, and I'm going to use my China bristle brush, load it onto my brush, and I do want to make sure it's nice and even. I always want to make sure that I offload my wax onto a piece of cardboard. This allows me to be able to make sure that my wax gets completely saturated into my brush, but it's all even. I don't want to go from the wax onto my piece of trim or my furniture. That's going to be too much wax, and it's going to take too long for it to dry. So you see in a motion that I'm taking my wrist and I'm constantly moving it. I will pounce in this because this does have a carved surface. And certain finishes and certain colors look better on certain things. So I like doing a cracked patina finish on something that has some carving, some detail on it. You wouldn't want to work on a really large surface area with no detail at all. So coming back, turning my wrist around, making sure that it's kind of a feathering effect. All right, so I want to make sure that I've allowed my light wax to dry for probably about 20, maybe 30 minutes at the most, depending on what the temperature is in the room that you're working on, or if you're working outside. Because I don't want the dark wax that I'm going to be putting on to add some age and some dark color to create a third wax color. That's really, really important. And also remember, with the dark wax, it takes so little to be able to get the look that you want. So I'm going to just get a little bit of wax on my brush. You see I'm offloading it. I'm going to want very, very little dark wax on my brush. And I want to make sure that I come around the edges first, because if I was working on a piece of furniture, where would it get dark? Where would it get dirty first? Around the edges of the piece. So that's where I'm going to start. Look how subtle it is. See how I'm just barely, almost dusting it. Because if I get it all over it, what's going to happen is it's going to look completely dead. It's not visually going to have the highs and lows, the lights and the darks of the waxes. So it's really important that I keep this feathery and very, very little. See how I'm working around the edge first? Then I'll work my way into the center just a little bit. And I do want to use what we call oval eye track or composition. I want to make sure that there's some areas a little darker than others. I don't want it to look 50-50. I don't want it to look 60-40, but I do want to make sure that it looks like an area that maybe would have been more authentic, that it would have gotten a little dirtier than others. So if I come in on this right side, now just imagine this is my drawer, maybe this is the front of my piece. So I'm just going to take the same concept and repeat it. I'm going to come over here just to be able to balance this out. Perfect. I don't want to do any more wax. That's perfect. I love the fact that it's a little lighter in here, it's a little darker over in here, but it's transitioning. Now, for the last step in the waxing process is my dust of ages. The dust of the ages does just that. If you think about a piece, if it was carved over a period of time, what's going to happen? Dust is going to get in the crevices. And what happens, it starts to add to the depth even more because it's going to allow certain details to show up. So I'm going to come back. Now, depending on the temperature of the area that you're working in again, you might want to allow the dark wax 10 or 15 minutes to actually set up so it doesn't come off when you start to buff it. And you can reuse this. If you're on a large surface area and it starts to, you start to have a lot that's not used, just dust it back into your container, or maybe a Tupperware container. And I am pretty liberal with it, as you can tell. So then I'm going to take a rag. I like to use t-shirt rags, things that don't have a lint in it. And I want to make sure that I use ample because it's the process of thinking of buffing a shoe. It's a hit drag type motion, and I'm only hitting the areas that actually are raised. I want to be able to have some of the elements down inside the crevices. Maybe I'm working on a cabinet door and I have some trim. I'm going to allow it to stay down in there. I'm not wanting to get all the dust of ages off. So you see as I'm coming back with my rag, how I'm just kind of buffing it. This process is important too because while I don't want it to be too dark, I don't want to leave too much dust on, I'm seeing how it's changing my finish and my color. And certain pieces that you're going to work on, as we're going to say, they're going to be a little grodier than others. So you might have it a little bit more refined. Maybe you're painting for a client and they're wanting to be able to have it a little bit more refined looking. Maybe you might not use as much dust. Another thing that you need to be careful If your wax is too wet, when you put your Dust of Ages on and it goes completely black, you know that you didn't have the tack there that you needed with the wax. So next time, make sure that you just fix that. You may say, well, I was actually happy with it, but I want it to be this paler gray. Then that way you know next time when you work on a piece. So now, last but not least, depending on the piece that I'm working on, I may come back just as a final application and add a little bit of dark wax here and there. But I'm not going to buff it after I've done this process. I'm going to leave it be. So I'm going to be really, really careful to the amount of wax that I'm going to use. I'm just going to come back here and there. You see there again, it's feathering. There's so little wax on my brush. Beautiful. Now you'll see, this is with my page blue and my French blue, but here's another example that I go and I put a red on as my base coat. Then I do my cracked patina and I do my black on top of it, and it was pulled. So you see how totally different it looks. Then also here's an example of the linen color was my base coat, and then I used Selznick gray on top of my cracked patina. So you see the versatility of color, how it can change, how you can layer them. It's endless. You can really have a lot of fun. And remember, because it's one-step paint, I can do these finishes on top of ceramic. I can do it on top of maybe a paper urn. I can do it on an iron urn. I can do it on fabric, whatever. Basically, it's endless opportunities for you to use your creativity and, of course, enjoy the bragging rights.